Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is the great Dan Shappir. Dan is one of the leading experts on web performance, evidenced by his enormous number of conference talks, as well as real-world applications of popular and strong techniques to amplify and extend the performance of properties on the web. Dan previously was the performance tech lead at Wix.com, the website builder, was also previously the performance tech lead at Next Insurance, and now leads web performance at Sisense. Dan has always been one of these people who's adamant about great performance leads to great experience on the web, and this episode is no exception. In this episode, we talk a lot about performance, getting the most out of the web. After diving a little bit into I was going to say delve, but that's too AI. After diving into Dan's background and context. From there, we talk a lot about the BF cache, the back forward cache, as well as a number of strategies you can use today to maximize the performance of your web properties. In the end, we talk about how you stay up to date with the ever-changing landscape of performance optimization. In this episode, if you wonder about how to squeeze the last few milliseconds of performance out of your web properties, or if you're a complete stranger to web performance at all, you will learn something from the great Dan Shappir. I can't wait for you to join this discussion and learn to that end. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at zero cost. This is very much separate to my day job. And how I can do that is through sponsors. So let's take a moment to thank them for making this podcast possible. The Contagious Code podcast is sponsored by Codecrafters. That's Codecrafters, that's tej.as/Codecrafters. Codecrafters is a teaching platform where you can level up your coding skills and has a teaching style very close to mine. What does that mean? My most popular talk ever is a talk called Deconstructing React, where we write a bunch of React components, but we don't import React. And so we're met with an error, cannot read property create element of undefined. And then instead of importing React, we do const react equals an object, and we add a property create element, and we slowly polyfill it to understand it. Codecrafters gives you a similar experience where you can learn things like Git, Docker, Redis, etc., and build them in a programming language that you're comfortable with, TypeScript, Python, whatever it may be. They have a paid tier and a free tier, but if you want to start paying and you want to get 40% off, then use the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/Codecrafters. The Contagious Code podcast is also partnered with that conference. That conference is a great place to meet people. It happens twice a year in Wisconsin and Texas, and has been super beneficial for my career as I gave the 90-minute keynote some time ago. If you want a free pass to that conference, then share this on social media and mention so, and we'll enter you into a raffle to win that. Finally, the podcast is sponsored by Stately. Stately is a great way to visualize the flow of application logic using finite state machines in their really powerful visual builder. And then you can export that to code, to JSON, and just fill in the business logic of how you get from state A to state B. If you'd like to give that a try, go to stately.ai. Thank you so much for sticking around. And also, if you're listening to the podcast on Apple and or Spotify, if you hit the follow button, that would be a great way to support it. And while you're there, if you can leave up to a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, hit the subscribe to the channel, because I hope you, at this point, you're actually interested in the podcast. And without further ado, here's my discussion with the great Dan Shappir. Dan Shappir, such a pleasure to have you on Contagious Code. Thank you for agreeing to do this with me, and I can't wait for a great discussion.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Tejas. You know that I really enjoy our conversations.
Yeah, the last time we spoke, I was in Tel Aviv, and since then, some really unfortunate things have happened. I want to take a moment at the beginning and just honor that you are in the middle of a war zone right now.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a very sad and distressing and depressing situation, and I really wish that it will end soon.
Yeah, I hope that by the time this episode is published, it's over. That would be so cool if this was outdated.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that it doesn't pay to be an optimist in the Middle East. Hopefully that changes one day, but it is what it is.
Well, I hope you're making the most of it. And if there's any way listeners can support this as well, we put links in the show notes because I think Everybody wants it to stop. So I did want to start off and honor that because I know this can't be easy to just sort of show up on a 2 hour podcast in the middle of all of that. So I thank you for that. And before we get started, I'd love it if you could maybe to the listeners. I'm sure you've got a bunch of fans because you've got all this conference activity. You're the leading expert on web performance and frameworks. I have got to see some of your talks. I'd love it if you could do a short intro for the listeners, the subset that don't know you, and then we can get into the discussion.
I'll see if I can keep it short because, as people can tell by looking at me, I've had quite a lengthy career. I'm old enough that my kids are actually getting into tech in professional positions. So, I yeah, yeah. I think,
In,
for
in that
example, you
case,
met.
in that case, the longer the better. I mean, there's probably a lot we can learn from you. I did meet your kids. Yes, I think that's what you're going to say.
Yeah, you've met, I think, at least my daughter, Carney. She recently started working at this startup. Interestingly, both my kids who have entered tech are in the gaming industry, which is amusing since my first professional job was also in gaming. So it's kind of interesting that, what goes around comes around. Uh, yeah. Wow. It was for me. It was a long time ago. The gaming scene was really different back then. I mean,
I'm
what
sorry
they're
for if this question is offensive in any way. I don't intend it to be, but was there the internet back then? Was it online gaming or was it like physical device gaming?
funny that you should ask, because the company that I worked at was actually trying to get into multi-user games over the network. But it wasn't the web because the internet, the home internet, was just starting to happen. So people were really getting the first modems back then. We're
Wow.
talking 90s. And the games that were really popular at the time were those kind of reactive games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter and stuff like that. And you couldn't really play those games with the latencies that you had in the internet back then. So what we were actually trying to do is to use the home cable networks. So, people had cables running, watching cable television shows. And we were trying to offer our thing to those cable companies so that they could actually host games on their platform. So, you could connect your cable to our box, stick it in your computer or your gaming console, and then play with your friends over the cable network. The big challenge was the chicken and the egg problem, that you couldn't convince the cable companies without games, and you couldn't convince the gaming companies to invest in this sort of thing without cable companies buying into it. So you had this kind of chicken and egg problem of trying to like jumpstart this whole thing. So what they actually hired me for was to create a couple of simple games for the platform, kind of a mini game sort of things, and that way we could both, you know, test out the platform, verify that the technology actually works, and also actually have some content that we could, sell to the cable companies. We already have
Mm.
such and such games. So I did a 3D flight simulator where you could fly around and shoot the other
What?
players. And we did a Doom style game where you would run in a maze and, kill the other players and all
What
the
what what programming language was this in?
C++ and assembly language.
What and what year was this?
Let me see. That was between 94 and 96.
Okay, so I was one. It was between age 1 and 3 for me. Unbelievable. Um, I,
Thank you for making me feel old.
hey, you started this by
Yeah,
saying you were
I
old, but
know, I
that's
know.
that's incredible. This Dan, this now opened up like a million more questions I wanted to. I mean, you walked in here and I was going to ask you about web performance and core web vitals, but now I have
So I'll give
an
you a
entire
story
new set
about
of questions.
performance. I'll give you a story about performance in that context. So I was working on the 3D Doom-like game where you were running inside this 3D maze, like a first-person shooter. Think Fortnite, but really, really, really simplified and not as sophisticated, not as realistic. Technologies that we had back then, and something that a single developer could implement in a month or two, not something overly sophisticated. And there actually, we didn't have anything like the Unreal Engine back then. So I literally had to create my own simple Unreal Engine in order to create all the 3D graphics. And it just ran, and I found out this, found the algorithm, adjusted it to our needs, and implemented it in C++, and it just ran too slow. The frame rate was
Mm.
too low. So I actually compiled the code down to assembly language and then hand optimized the assembly language code to make it sufficiently performant. And I was able to make it like, I don't recall, like 10 or 20 times faster just by hand optimizing the assembly language and making, keeping things in registers and using various, CPU optimizations that I could do by hand that the compiler wasn't sophisticated enough to do.
Wow. I'm lost for words. This guy handwriting assembly, and now I sort of see the dots sort of connect. Why you're still to this day so into like web performance and latency and optimization and core web vitals and all of it. I have a follow up question, and I realize you're not finished with your introduction. So finish your introduction, and then I have some questions.
No, no, go for it because the introduction is going to be long.
Okay. If let's pause here, but I do want to hear the rest of your intro. You mentioned you were making games for the internet, or excuse me, the web wasn't a thing, but you were making games for local networks. This prompts the question. We use these terms every day: the internet, the web, my network. What is the distinction between maybe my network is clear, it's local, but in terms of wide area networks, is there a distinction between the web and the internet? And if yes, what is that?
Well, at the end of the day, it's computers connected to each other via wires. Or optical connections these days, but it's still wires, or wirelessly if it's Wi-Fi and it's local. But it's still computers talking to each other using various communication protocols. Now, these have been around forever. The internet was basically just taking this concept and extending it to a global reach. So the internet kind of started like in was called DARPANET or something like that originally, started in the 70s between universities and also the USA Department of Defense. So you actually had army bases and universities connected to one another, and then slowly the rest of us got onto this network. And you had eventually, and there were various competing protocols, but eventually TCP came along in terms of how we can effectively, can communicate. The computers can communicate over the wire. Um, like the networks that I'm talking about, the ones that were actually using the infrastructure of the cable companies, they were not using that TCP/IP at all. They were using some, UDP-like protocol that, we developed in-house. The funny thing was, by the way, is that because the internet and the web was starting to happen, is that when we did go to all these cable companies and try to sell them on our gaming platform, they said, "Well, this is really, really cool, but can you also connect us to the internet?"
Mm.
So the funny thing is that after I actually left the company, I was there for about 2 years. About a year or so later, the company actually pivoted and became a cable modem company because that's what all the cable companies actually wanted. They wanted connectivity to the web rather than, those games that ran on their local networks. Um, Now, the web is effectively an application, you could think about it, or a system, an application running on top of that internet infrastructure. So, like you have email on top of the internet, and you had FTP on top of the internet, you also have the web on top of the internet. So, you can think about the internet as the actual physical infrastructure and the lower level protocols, and the web as this higher level construct that's running on top of it.
And the web is a collection of HTML documents, basically.
Yeah, and the HTTP protocol that connects the things together.
Right. Okay. So web so the internet is more at, if we talk protocol to protocol, is TCP/IP, and the web is HTTP. Yes, this makes sense. This makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Although if you
I
look at
sense
it
some hesitation.
like
What?
HTTP 3 is actually not using TCP anymore. It's implemented on top directly on top of UDP. That's because our world has changed, and with more mobile browsing and whatnot, the TCP protocol was not created with mobile in mind. The TCP protocol was created when I would need to check on Wikipedia, but I think it was created in the 60s or 70s. And and today we've got mobile devices and cellular networks, so it's kind of a different world.
Yeah.
Also, obviously, networks have changed. Latency and bandwidth aren't what they used to be. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
things have changed.
This is
Going
this
back to
is this
the
sounds like another.
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say this sounds like another episode of the podcast I need to do as a lecture about all of this.
yeah, for sure. By the way, the second company that I worked at was called a company called Backweb. That was starting to go into the dot-com era of the late 90s, early 2000s. That company actually ran on top of the internet infrastructure, but wasn't actually a web company so much. It was what we had developed was this mechanism which could use the available, let's call it background connectivity, to download large content while you were connected.
Mm.
So think about let's say you're browsing the web and you hit a page, and now you download the content. Now you start to read the page. So the connection is kind of idle while you're reading. So we would identify those idle periods and download content in the background because connectivity was so limited back then. If you wanted to download something like an
Wow.
audio file, you know, it would just take too long. So being able to download it
Yeah.
like in these like smaller chunks in the background without you noticing it, and eventually when it was fully downloaded, you'd get a pop-up saying it's there. Now you can listen to that song. In,
Mm.
in this day and age of everything is streaming and bandwidth is so readily available, it's really difficult to think about that. It's in a lot of ways it's kind of what people who are in various regions in the world still experience, I guess, be it Africa or India, but we in no more, let's call it technologically developed nations, um, or at least that have better infrastructure, we often take these things for granted. And I at least have I remember the days when this wasn't the case. Let's put it this way.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. Okay, let's continue the career. So this
So
was
yeah,
first job, second job.
so that was the company that actually got me into the web to begin with, because um, I built what I would consider to be maybe the world's first offline first rich web application, and I did it back in 1998, 99.
Wow. Offline. You say
So
offline first. Could it also be called local first? Given the
yes,
local first movement.
yes. So think I described how we downloaded content in the background. So we
Mm-hmm.
kind of pivoted. We tried to do the consumer space, then we tried to do the enterprise space. We kind of pivoted between the two. And when we were in the enterprise space, one of our products was something called a marketing encyclopedia. That's a tool for salespeople that when they meet customers, they have various documents and brochures and videos and whatnot about the various products that they can show potential customers. Now, all this content was available online, but again, going back to the 90s, it was very possible, for example, for a traveling salesperson in the Midwest to not have any connectivity when they're visiting a customer. So the idea was to download all this content in the background using that efficient delivery protocol that I just described before, and have it, at least the important things, available on your local computer, on your local laptop, that you could show to the customer even if you were offline because you had no connectivity. So we built a web interface for the online stuff, but then we also wanted to build an interface for the offline stuff. And I was kind of the technical lead in charge of that project, or the architect of that project, of the client side. And the initial approach was, let's build some sort of a native client, because how are
Mm.
you going to do that sort of a thing? And then I said, hey, but that's going to create this kind of discrepancy where that when you're online it's a web interface, but when
Yeah.
you're offline it's a totally different native interface that kind of, so can we create a local offline interface that's still a web interface? Now, what made it possible was that it was exactly when Microsoft released IE4. Now, we
Mm.
love to deride IE, and deservedly so, but we forget that IE kind of invented the DOM and dynamic HTML. Like the whole
It did
concept,
really?
yeah, the whole concept that you can write JavaScript that modifies the DOM any which way. Microsoft IE was the first one to do that.
Wow.
Now, they were totally not standard compliant. A lot of the standards didn't even exist, but they were the first ones that did it. Like Netscape, just, they had some DOM access from JavaScript because Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript, did work at Netscape. Um, but it was really limited. You could do some things with forms and document write, and that's more or less it. And Microsoft introduced the inner HTML. So all of
Mm.
a sudden you could do this, crazy shit that you could. Am I allowed to say shit?
Sure.
Okay, so you could do all that crazy shit in with JavaScript in the browser. And I said, hey, you know, can we build such a sophisticated interface in JavaScript using JavaScript? So the initial idea was maybe we will create some sort of a local web server and serve stuff from localhost, as it were, into the browser. But it turns out that you can't run a local web server on Windows 95. Just can't do it. The operating system just can't handle that. So
Wow.
we were looking for a different approach, and what we ended up doing was we created something called an ActiveX control. That's like a plugin that runs
Yeah.
written in C++ that ran inside the browser, but it was headless, and it actually pushed information to the JavaScript, and the JavaScript used that to modify the DOM and construct the user interface around it. And we did that back in 98, 99, and it
Wow.
worked.
Wow. I have to really acknowledge how impressive that is given the constraints of that day. And I feel like that should set you up to almost do these things, quote unquote, in your sleep now because you did it back then. Of course, things have changed, but things have changed probably in a good direction, right? We have a lot of
Oh yeah,
standardization.
for
And
sure. Yeah.
so,
By the way, I'm part of that standardization. I'm also a member of the W3C Web Performance Working Group. So I'm all for standardization. I think the open web is like the best thing ever, one of the greatest invention of humanity. So I'm all for it. But yeah, we made do with what we had back then.
that's so cool.
And yeah. And by the way, I ran into the first kind of performance issues in the context of the web because when we built this marketing encyclopedia, it was built to handle like 100 documents, stuff like that. And then the salespeople sold this to HP as a tool for their engineers with documents about all the products. So the products in the product catalog. So all of a sudden, instead of having like let's say a few dozen, maybe 100 items that to show in the list in this kind of JavaScript managed UI, all of a sudden we had 1,000
Oh no.
or so yeah, and it just, we ran into incredible performance issues. We ended up fixing it by just into doing it with paging or something like that, because when we tried to just display the entire list, I just basically said I give up and crashed. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So then was the
Uh,
next problem to solve virtualization? How would you even have solved that with like almost non-existent standards and the constraints of the day?
yeah, well, it was, you'd call it vanilla JavaScript basically, but
Okay. So you just literally like use an algorithm to identify the I don't know what extent of APIs were available. So I'd love to describe the solution to you, and you tell me if this was realistic in that day or not. Because to me, like if I wanted to do virtualization with vanilla JavaScript, I would identify, okay, how many items do I have? What is the size of my viewport? What is the height per item? And then based on that, you have essentially cursoring by DOM element, right? And you scroll and you hide the ones that are out of the viewport logically, and you introduce
I
ones that should be in the viewport.
ideally, that's what you want to do. The problem was that especially IE4, had really bad memory leak issues in the
Yeah.
actual implementation. So if the DOM got
Wow.
too big, the browser would literally just crash. Uh, so you had to contend with that. I'll give you an example of one of the things I did there. So for example, you had the ability to filter the documents that you're seeing. So you had like this search box. You could put in some sort of a filter expression, and the way that I wrote it, is something that is actually would be a bad practice today, and not the thing you should do. Is I literally generated the string of the JavaScript function to filter it, so that I could create the minimal amount of JavaScript to actually filter the list. Um, so the filter function was actually dynamically created on the fly, and then effectively like you do an exec, uh, or eval.
Do you mean an
Sorry,
eval? Yeah.
yeah, I mean eval. Actually, it was a new function, but it's the same thing, and that's totally what you should not do today, because today it gets in the way of the JavaScript engine's optimizer. So, but we did back
Yeah.
then there was no JavaScript engine optimizer to get in the way of. So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was there, and funnily enough, I left when I left that company after the bubble burst. I actually went total backend and did nothing related to the web for a good number of years afterwards. And then in around 2009, I was working at a company that was doing remote access solutions. So think about, you're running Windows desktops or Windows applications, either remotely, you're connecting to your office computer from home, because again, not a lot of people just didn't have laptops, or you might be running your desktop in the cloud for compliance reasons, security reasons, access reasons, whatever, and you're connecting remotely. So it's being able to view your desktop remotely, but not just for the purpose of doing a presentation or sharing or anything. It's for for actual work. So you want to have an experience that is as close as possible to local computing. and
Mm.
and our solution was like most other solutions back then, or essentially all other solutions, was a native client. So you installed our client, written in C++, whatever, on your computer, and you connected to the remote server that way. And then back in 2009, I had this idea, hey, maybe I can actually make this work inside the browser. I mean, instead of downloading and installing a native client, could I get implement a server that effectively supports web protocols like HTTP, and connect to it and get from it the remote desktop. And I
Mm.
went to the company's management, and I pitched my idea. And and their response is really amusing because it's totally not a response that you would get today, which is, what's the upside? What's the benefit of not needing to install anything and just using it from the web? Well, something that's so immediately obvious for us today was totally not obvious back then. And the funny thing was that they actually did me a favor, because in 2009 the web wasn't ready yet. But then in 2010, 2011, there was the famous Steve Jobs email that killed Flash. Are you familiar
Yeah.
with this whole story?
But please share it for the listeners. I'm sure people
Yeah,
aren't.
so basically, Apple was starting to promote the iPhones. The iPhone came out in 2007. Initially, the idea of the iPhone, it's funny now, given uh, how Apple is so working against the web in a lot of ways these days, unfortunately. But back then, the concept was that the iPhone that would primarily be running web applications. And a lot of web applications back then were written using Flash, but Flash was really not appropriate for mobile devices. It would basically just, drain the battery, and it was also, Apple being Apple did not want to tie their fortunes and be dependent on some other company like Macromedia or what was it then, Adobe.
Adobe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Adobe bought Macromedia. Um, so basically, Steve Jobs decided that the solution would be web and the web standards. So Apple really promoted new web technologies like Canvas, like WebSockets. So all of a sudden, with Canvas and WebSockets, you could really create a viable solution to this remote access solution, because WebSockets give you a full duplex connection, so which is what you want when you're accessing remote, you know, Windows applications. You want to be able to type or move your mouse and get immediate response. And also, you could draw the UI, the remote user interface, in a canvas. So you didn't need to kind of simulate it using, you know, DOM elements or whatever, which are really not appropriate for that use case, because you're basically just drawing pixels. So
Yeah.
so basically when I saw these technologies come about, I said, hey, this is now not just doable, it actually makes sense. So again, I went to management, I pitched it again, apparently much more enthusiastically, because they bought into it, and we started this project. And going in, like I said, we already had a native client. And the assumption was that, on the best case scenario, that probably the web client is going to be much slower and not as performant as the native client. So with a native
Yeah.
client, you would literally be able to see, like, if you were running some sort of video or animation on the remote desktop, you could actually see it in a somewhat reasonable frame rate on your local device. That's not going to happen with the web. I put a goal for myself to achieve parity with a native client. So that was my in terms
Wow.
of performance. And the funny thing is that when the solution was finally released, the web client actually outperformed the native client,
In
because
terms of remote desktop access.
yeah, in terms of frame rate, of
What?
responsiveness.
So I could watch a video remotely on some other machine through the web client, and the latency would be so good that I get the 60 frames or 30 or
No, well,
24 frames per second.
you didn't get 60 frames per second. You got six, but
Okay. The
the
native
native
client was
client
worse.
did four. Yeah,
Wow, that's
because
astonishing.
it's not really a video protocol. The remoting
Yeah.
now you have actually better remoting solutions that literally play the remote video at really good frame rates. But back then,
Yeah.
we were basically just sending screens over the wire. So, it was building the images and sending them on the fly. It wasn't a video protocol. It was a sequence of images, as it were.
Mm.
So, I think we got to around 10 FPS or something like that.
Wow.
Bec because it turns out that the browser is really, really good at graphics and at networking. And if you don't get in the way of the browser and just let it do its job, don't try to overload it with too much JavaScript, then the browser is really, really good at what it does. And that was a really important lesson for me, and one that I take to this day in terms of working on performance, is that, try to let the browser do its thing. Whenever you
Yeah.
can leverage the built-in features and capabilities, and don't try to, replicate them or re-implement them in JavaScript. Because at the end of the day, you're just going to create something worse.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so in this case, by just, sending, let's say, JPEGs over the wire. For example, the browser is GPU accelerated. The people who built the browser are really smart engineers. Those C++ developers, or Rust developers working on the browsers themselves. They're excellent engineers, and they've done a whole lot of work to leverage the GPU and do a lot of sophisticated things that can really get you awesome performance if you don't block it, if you don't ruin it. I kind of joke that web performance is this competition of who wins, the C++ developers making the web faster, or the JavaScript developers making the web slower. Which is kind of unfortunate, but that's the reality, it seems, in a lot of ways.
It's like a
Um,
tug of war.
yeah, certainly is. And then I left that company and arrived at Wix. And when I got to Wix, I was being interviewed by Wix's VP of R&D. Wix was a lot smaller company back then. That was back in 2014. And for those of you who don't know, Wix is a company that does a CMS and a web, which is also a website builder. So you build the websites using drag and drop. And um, back then, Wix had really significant performance issues. When you built a website using Wix, first of all, you could tell that it was Wix because the design capabilities were really limited back then. And you could also tell that it was Wix because it was really, really slow. And he was looking to solve that problem. So when we spoke, and he learned about all that experience that I had with optimizing things for the web on top of web technologies, he got really excited and hired me as the performance tech lead for Wix, which is the role that I basically had at Wix for the duration of my stay there of 7.5 years. And during that time, I'll give a spoiler up front. During that time, we managed to improve Wix's for example, the loading performance of pages built on the Wix platform by over 20 times. So not 2 times faster, not three
What?
times faster, 20 times faster.
1,000%. Unbelievable.
Mhm.
I want to dive into how. I think everybody at this point, the first question on the mind is how. But I will let you I will let you cook a bit and finish out your tenure. So Wix, you solve the problems,
Yeah.
and then
So
you sell insurance now. Is that?
Yeah, I'm an insurance agent, exactly. For the past 2.5 years, so after leaving Wix, I joined a company called Next Insurance. We are an insurtech unicorn. We are an insurance company, but the thing is that we sell insurance online. So instead of going to your insurance agent, you go to our website. We sell insurance to small businesses, so tiny, small, and medium businesses in the US. And so think restaurant, or hairdresser, wedding photographer,
Yeah.
these people like that need insurance. Somebody fixes your roof, in case they fall, they need to be covered in terms of insurance. So that's our target audience. And everything is done online and using also machine learning and stuff like that to analyze the applications and come up with so you can literally just buy insurance without having to deal with a person at all. Just do it all online really quickly.
Wow.
Um,
So AI has completely taken a lot of jobs. It sounds like here.
Apparently it is. Is that surprising?
Well, it's not surprising. It's this is why I keep telling listeners of this podcast it's really good to be on the right side of the AI revolution,
Hmm.
because You can sit there and think it's not going to take your job, or you can acknowledge it probably will and then prepare for it. And so, like you, for example, you're on the right side of this, but some
At least
poor
for
insurance
now.
worker. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Now look, it wasn't just AI. I mean, the web and technology was eating jobs has been eating jobs for a
Yes.
long time now. I mean, think about, travel agents. Remember those
Yeah.
days when wherever you flew somewhere, you would sit with a travel agent who would help you plan your trip? When's the last time you did that?
Yeah.
Or when's the last time you went physically to your bank? So a lot of jobs are kind of disappearing even before the AI revolution, but for sure, AI is going to accelerate a lot of these processes.
Yeah.
That being said, up till now, up until the AI revolution, whenever new technology came along and got rid of some jobs, newer jobs were created in their place. In fact, more new jobs were often created. So, like, when cars came along, the horse tenders, they lost their jobs, but we needed all of a sudden a lot of car mechanics. So more jobs were created. It'll be interesting to see if the same thing happens with AI. It's not a
Yeah.
certainty.
Yeah.
Maybe this
Definitely.
is going to be the first technical revolution where not more jobs are created and more jobs are lost. We will see.
We will see indeed. Okay, so next insurance. Thank you for that primer on
Yeah,
what they do. What you
yeah,
are. Yeah.
I'm the performance tech lead at Next, so I enjoy doing it at Wix. I do also do it at Next. The big difference is that at Next I do it both on the front end and on the back end. So I'm on the front end, I'm dealing with the regular stuff like React and Angular and web technologies and core web vitals and whatnot. And on the back end, I'm dealing with database queries and making sure they're properly indexed and various microservices talking efficiently to one another. So I kind of expanded my role to cover both sides. So that was the big change for me. Yeah, having fun.
That's
I like coding, so the more the
yeah.
merrier.
You've not only do you like it, you've liked it for longer than I've been alive, which I think is so cool. And this gives me the basis for so many questions I want to ask you. Um, question number one: you mentioned, and I think the big sort of the magnum opus question is how did you increase the performance of Wix by 20x? We will get there. We're not there yet. I do have some questions I want to get out of the way before that. Maybe just one, which is this: you mentioned the browser engineers are so smart, and the browser is an extremely capable runtime. It's maybe the most capable runtime in the world. It's not your words, that's mine, but it is extremely capable regardless. You mentioned the browser can do a lot if you don't get in its way. I'm wondering, what are some ways we do get in the way of the browser, and then how can we avoid getting in the way of the browser?
The most obvious way that we get in the way of the browser is by overloading it. The main place where we overload it is with JavaScript, but
Mm.
sometimes we even overload it with CSS and HTML. But on the main part, it's mostly with just too much JavaScript. Um, the browser, like you said, is an amazing device, but it also has various restrictions that stem from the way that various let's call it standards, whether they're de facto standards or de jure standards. Um, but they're effectively standards nonetheless. So, like the main thing about the web is that it's incredibly backward compatible. Like you take the first website that Tim Berners-Lee created back in what 1985, something like that, and it still works. And that's a great thing because it means that once you build something that works on the web, you're kind of assured that it will work forever and it will work on various newer platforms that weren't even imagined when the web was created. Like it will work on Apple Vision Pro, but the downside is that certain ways in which the browser or the web works are kind of set in stone. And one of the things is that the browser is prime. It's not exactly true, but it's kind of mostly true, is kind of single-threaded. You've got that thing called the event loop that handles the events that come in. It might be a network event of some content arriving over the network. It might be a user interaction, a user clicking or tapping, or it might be a set timeout. And all of these events that happen are all handled on the same main thread. So if that main thread is too busy because you're running I don't know, 3 MB of gzip minified JavaScript, then it's too busy to handle the user interactions in a timely manner. It's too busy to update the screen at a sufficiently high frame rate, and the result is jank or an unresponsive user interface. So that's definitely like one of the big problems that we see on the web. Like, and it's really amusing for me because, like we look at like, let's say we open the Chrome DevTools network tab, let's say, and on a typical website, and we see it download a megabyte of JavaScript, and we think, well, okay, that's reasonable. Is it really? I mean, just so you know, when I was, we were talking about things in the past. When I wrote my first game when I was 14, it was like this kind of like Donkey Kong like one level game. I wrote it on the computer that I had back then. Do you know how much memory it had? How much
Yeah.
RAM that thing had? Throw out a number.
256K.
4K.
Was it 4 kilobytes?
4 kilobytes of RAM. So I wrote
Wow.
a game that you could play running, jumping over barrels, stuff like that, in 4K of RAM. And you tell me that 1 MB of JavaScript is not enough for your website, which is effectively a glorified form. Tell me why is that?
It's because we need React. I can't. I'm sorry. I have major laughing attack. It's because we need the latest and greatest use form hook, use form state. I'm laughing because it's so comical. I like that you said it's basically a glorified form because it's true. I've made the mistake early in my career of I had to build a login form, one page, and a login form, and I made the mistake of reaching for like full on React and React DOM for that. And I think a lot of people are making that mistake, right? That's why we can't, because we're not limited. You were limited with your memory. You had 4 kilobytes of RAM, and I don't even want to think about how much disk space you had. But this is why I think constraints are awesome
You want
because
to
we're
know how much
forced to
disk
innovate.
space I had?
Tell me.
Zero.
Zero. You had no disk space at all. So everything was in memory.
No, there
Wow.
was no
And
disk.
I, I don't even know how to process this. What do you mean there was no disk? Where did you say, was it external
A
storage like
tape
a floppy
recorder.
drive? A tape Jesus. Okay. I
You know how the old modems made sounds when you sent bits over
yeah.
the well, the tape recorder recorded those sounds. That was how you saved the program. So you actually uh, turned on the tape recorder and you could actually play the memory dump into the tape recorder.
I don't know if you're like trolling me or if this is
No,
actually how
no, this
software used
is
to work.
actually
Unbelievable. But you see, this is what I keep saying. I think constraints are beautiful because then we're forced to innovate. And I do believe we are so unconstrained by the enormous resources people in privileged economies have in terms of like, we don't even need it, man. Like my mother will have like, and this is not a dig on my mother. This is just commentary on the status quo. Like
he made
some
you.
random, yeah, no, some random person will have like a 24 terabyte RAM MacBook M5 Premium to run Netflix. And so when that's the case in most of the developed world, we don't feel the pain of constraints. Therefore, we do not innovate. This is my thesis. And so I think you innovated so well because you had the constraints. We don't have them anymore. And this is why I think we overload the browsers because to us, we're not overloading our M5 premium Mac browsers, but we
Yeah.
are overloading the browsers of people we don't know and people who we should include, right? It's an accessibility thing.
It's definitely an accessibility thing. For example, and it might be you just in a different context. Think about the
Yeah.
fact that, for example, you're traveling, and which I guess you do a lot because you speak at a lot of conferences, and I'm sure you've been in situations where your data plan was really limited and your connectivity wasn't great. And think about the
Yeah.
situation where you're in the airport and you're trying to go online in the airport in the airport on the airport Wi-Fi, trying to open or your data plan, trying to open the airline website, and you're stuck because they're downloading this huge background image of a plane taking off, which you could care nothing, you could care less about. You just want to see whether or not your flight is going to be on time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
What you're saying happens to me every 2 weeks or so. Wild.
And
Yeah. And
yeah, and we don't. And by the way, it's the easiest thing in the world to check in the browser settings to see whether data saver is on. And if it's on, just don't download that background image, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Okay, so overloading the browser is the biggest problem. So then, I want to put out here a takeaway, something, a protocol, a way of working for people who work in tech to sort of take to their everyday life, and that is this: would you say it's advisable for engineers, front end, back end, whatever it may be, maybe engineers building for the browser, to keep at the forefront of their mind, it's a good idea to keep things small? Is that statement something good to keep at the forefront of your mind as you build on the web? And so this could mean I don't have too many DOM nodes, I don't have too much JavaScript, I don't have too much CSS. I try to keep it all as lean as possible. And then maybe when I come to choose a framework for my UI, I consider something like Quick, which is deterministically 1 kilobyte on first load.
Well, yes and no, because at the end of the day, the lightest page is the blank page, and it's kind of useless. So you are trying to implement something that provides value, and there are certain requirements that come from product that you're trying to meet, and to implement something that actually, serves a certain purpose. But I think it would behoove us to remember, like you said, to kind of know who our users are. I
Yeah.
mean, for example, let's say if you're selling Mercedes cars in the States, then you can probably assume that your potential customers have the latest iPhones, connectivity, and you can definitely take advantage of that to create a very rich and interactive experience. If, on the other hand, I gave the example, you're building a web page for an airline company, and you need to take into account that a lot of your potential users are going to be on data plans and are going to be in situations where their connectivity is pretty poor, and they're really under pressure to load the thing really quickly because they're afraid that they might miss their flight. You need to be courteous to them and to
Yeah.
respect their needs. So you really need to try to understand who your users are and adjust what you're delivering to your users rather than try to force your users to adjust to whatever vision you have of the thing that you're delivering. A great example is one that is given by my friend. I don't know if you know him, Alex Russell. You know
I do
Alex?
know him. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, an amazing guy. So he kind of differentiates when looking at single page applications versus multi-page applications. And he basically makes this sort of a differentiation about the depth of interaction. Like how many clicks are you likely or how many user interactions is your app likely going to be to get in a particular session. And he says that we web developers usually overestimate the amount of interactions that our websites or web applications will get by tenfold. Like, we think that people
Huh.
will, do hundreds of interactions, and usually it's just one or two, and then they leave, or they, do something else. And
Mm.
consequently, we built we build our websites and our web experiences with one scenario in mind, when in fact our users have a very different expectations and needs. And and as a result, maybe we're building this really heavy single page application that's downloading like the entire world, and where we could have built something, I don't know, maybe using Astro or something, which would have been a single page application, and which would have been much more appropriate because you end up downloading a lot less stuff that
Yeah.
most users never actually interact with. Another great example is, people like to build these really, really long pages, where you scroll down and see more and more content. Like the entire site is this like one really long page. I'm sure you've seen that.
I've
Uh,
seen I've seen that as the HTML spec is that it's a 25 megabyte HTML document.
Yeah, but that actually makes sense because then you go to that document with the explicit intention of downloading that document, and you know what you're in for. Um, Whereas when I just go to this random website for some e-commerce site and they download like I
Yeah.
they, and their page is like 50 screens long.
Yeah.
Like, do you
Yeah.
really think any visitor is going to scroll down 50 pages? 50 screens worth of
Yeah.
page?
No.
It's
Not
it's
at all.
just not going to happen. So why are you
Yeah.
putting all this content in there? Now, you might say, but yeah, you can work around it. You can do lazy loading and stuff and stuff like that. Why are you even putting yourself in this situation where you need to come up with all sorts of hacks and workarounds instead of
Yeah.
just building the page that actually fits the actual need of your
Yeah.
potential user?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's really an act of service to the user and has to be driven by empathy and understanding your user. This is really cool because I asked Kent C. Dodds the same question in season 1, and this was exactly his answer as well. Is like learn your users, understand, and then serve them. And if you do that, you're going to be fine. Thank you. That is a really insightful answer. My next question is this: how did you increase the performance of Wix 20x?
So first of all, I actually wrote an article, a case study about it on Smashing
On
Magazine.
Smashing Magazine. Yes, we'll put the link to that in the show notes.
The thing is, first and foremost, is that you need to get the buy-in from the organization because this, in many cases, this is not a trivial effort. You're not, you might find some low-hanging fruit that you can, or quick wins that you can do and make sometimes really significant difference. But if you're really looking to create cross-organization-wide performance culture, this really needs to be something that the organization is willing to put effort and resources into. So I can kind of split my stay at Wix into two parts. The first part, I was part of this really small dedicated team. Some of the time I was the team that was actually do kind of running around and doing cleanup after everybody else.
Mm.
And you know, I did make a difference and I did make an impact and we did achieve some nice wins. But at the end of the day, if you're this one developer who's focusing on performance and you've got, I don't know, 50 or 100 other developers that are just writing code and, and code has weight, you're not going to win. So the big difference really came when when Wix decided that performance is going to be a strategic priority for the entire organization. And then my role kind of switched because instead of running around everybody and trying to prod them into improving their performance or doing cleanup after them, the role flipped and now they were running after me,
Yeah.
trying to get me to help them because they actually had needed to report to senior management what they did in terms of performance over the past, let's say, quarter.
Mm.
And and now the job became, how do I support their effort? How do I provide them with tools, with education, with the processes and stuff like that?
Did you were you influential in management changing the core value of Wix to become performance heavy, or was that a decision they came to themselves?
Well, it was an inevitable decision because of some certain market realities. First of all, when I joined in 2014, 70% of sessions were on desktop and 30% of sessions were on mobile. Now I think it's like 80% of sessions are on mobile and 20% of the sessions are on
Wow.
desktop. And mobile is inherently more constrained in terms of performance than desktops. So that was one big difference. Another big difference is that Wix expanded into much more into the global markets. So instead of selling primarily in Europe and in, let's say, North America, Wix started to sell a lot in India, in South America, and places like that. And it was a whole new ball game. And another thing that I think it's worth touching on, because today is kind of a special date in that regard, Google really started pushing and promoting web performance. So from a situation where potential customers were kind of ignorant about the need for web performance, all of a sudden you had a situation where potential customers were actually evaluating the performance of the website that they built on the Wix platform. And if the website wasn't sufficiently performant, they would just go somewhere else.
Mm.
And they actually, they had Google educating them about it and giving tools that they could use to actually check the performance of the website that they built using various technologies and compare. And then Google also made site performance a ranking factor. So all of a sudden they said, hey, I have this website that I'm building. I want it to rank because what's the point otherwise? And if it's too slow, then I won't, and that's bad. So yeah. So all of these things kind of forced Wix to tackle performance head on.
Mhm.
And like I said, originally performance was really shitty, and we really had to tackle it. Let me just list a couple of the things that we've done. So Wix was actually one of the first organizations to use React outside the Meta Facebook. Uh, so, by the way, well, it's been a while, but not so long ago, we had that documentary about React,
Mhm.
and I was kind of peeved that they didn't mention Wix because Wix adopted React back in 2014. Um, and it's still one of the biggest users of React out there. I don't know if you know this, but if you look at the Google stats, and approximately 20 something percent of all React sites are actually Wix
What?
sites.
20%?
20 something percent,
Wow.
somewhere between 20 and 25%.
Wow.
So so actually something like not quite a quarter, maybe closer to a fifth of all React sites are actually Wix sites because Wix uses React. So from the Google perspective, the site is a Wix site, but it's also a React site.
Incredible.
Um, yeah. Um, So initially, it was totally client-side rendered, and you cannot achieve good loading performance with client-side rendering. It's just you can't.
Yeah.
It's because and a quick explainer of why, because usually you then download an empty blank HTML page,
That's blocked
which
until
downloads.
JavaScript downloads, right?
Then you download the JavaScript, you parse the JavaScript, you run the JavaScript. JavaScript then does the AJAX call to get the data. It then parses the data, builds a DOM, and only then does the DOM actually start downloading stuff like images and fonts. So all this stuff needs to happen before you can actually show anything. Um, Now, it's okay if you're building maybe an internal application, like an internal dashboard or something like that. But if you're building an e-commerce site, let's say, or a marketing or a landing page for your marketing site, it just doesn't fly. So implementing SSR. Wix actually implemented SSR
By
back in
SSR you
2017.
mean server side rendering
Server-side
just to
rendering.
okay.
Yes, running React on the server side, rendering React into an this, stream or an HTTP response, and then doing the hydration thing on the client side. What we today get with frameworks like Next.js
Yeah.
or Remix.
Yeah.
They provided out of the box. Wix built it themselves because first of all, these things just didn't exist back then, And also the Wix scenario is kind of different with the whole different scaling thing. Just to give an idea, Wix on their infrastructure is running something like 300 million websites.
Wow.
So so it's kind of a different scaling issue than what you would normally do. Um, so yeah, so introducing SSR. Another one was initially a lot of the layout work that Wix did in terms of positioning elements on the screen in order to support interfaces built using drag and drop were done with JavaScript.
Mm.
So implementing those using CSS, pure CSS, using CSS Flexbox and Grid made this much faster because you didn't need to run JavaScript in order to properly position the elements on the screen. Um, and also a lot of work around caching and using CDNs. Really aggressively caching stuff and serving content off of CDNs using edge computing where appropriate. Um, Investing and effectively rewriting the software. Uh, when I was at Wix, we effectively rewrote the entire Wix client from scratch twice.
Wow. In 7 years.
I In a period of 7 years.
Wow.
I would estimate that just on the context of performance, Wix invested several hundred man hours of engineering effort. Man years, sorry, several hundred man years of engineering effort just into things related to performance.
Wow. That's absolutely no surprise. Why you're so into performance. I mean, you've had it since the beginning of your career. Wix recognized it and doubled down on it, giving you even more ammunition there. So just that list, in case listeners want to write it down if they haven't written it down already. Number one, adding SSR for the reason that client rendering is just too slow. It's too slow for network waterfall blocking reasons. Second was, and this one I think is especially interesting. I wonder if we can talk more about this. The second one is using modern CSS instead of JavaScript to lay out and style your components and your pages. This is cool because oftentimes when we talk about performance optimization, we think JavaScript, but this is a case where CSS sort of came to the rescue. And then third was, of course, using caching and CDNs, caching intelligently and CDNs everywhere, which I also think is really interesting as the basis of a discussion because caching could mean so many different things. It could mean HTTP cache or server cache or CDN cache, etc. Let's maybe talk a little bit about using CSS to amplify the performance of your web application. And maybe I know Wix probably doesn't use Tailwind because that came much later, but also its application there. So if I understand correctly, your case at Wix was you were using JavaScript for laying out elements a certain way, and this was before the days of grid and flexbox, which are first class ways of laying out things either as columns or as rows. So when those became generally available, was the effort literally just like I'm going to remove a bunch of this JavaScript code and then pivot to
Oh,
CSS? Or
no, it was much more difficult than that, again, primarily for backward compatibility issues, because like the web itself, Wix prides itself on backward compatibility. So if somebody built a website on Wix back in 2012 and they never touched the website that they built since then, it still needs to run. And it runs using the latest and greatest technology.
wow.
So all the websites get automatically updated and upgraded. That's one of the benefits of using a platform like Wix. By the way, Wix is not unique in that. It's also true for platforms like Shopify or Squarespace. So although obviously I'm less familiar with them. So one of the advantages of these managed solutions, they have limitations. They constrain what you're able to do, but they don't have so much of that long tail situation that you see with more open frameworks like let's say a Next.js running on top of Vercel, where somebody might build their website using a certain version of Next and then neglect to ever update. But so it was a challenge making sure that we were able to replicate the exact behavior that we had before. So it was a significant effort, but it was doable, and we did it. And yeah, but it's also worth noting, by the way, if we're talking about performance in CSS, that CSS can also get you into performance trouble. I mean, if
Exactly.
you build overly complex uh, um, uh, web pages with lots of DOM nodes, like you gave the example of the HTML spec. If you go into that HTML spec document, open DevTools, and then try to, execute all various CSS selectors on it, you will see that they take a while to execute because they just need to process so many DOM nodes. And so with CSS, you can get into trouble in two ways. You can make overly complicated CSS selectors, or you can just have a too large document which just takes too long to process because you kind of need to combine the HTML and the CSS together to get the layout and the rendering output that you expect. So you need to be cognizant of that and think about the things that you're building. And by the way, a quick tip or quick win in this context is to look at something called the content visibility CSS property. Are you familiar with it?
I am not.
So content visibility was added by Google a while back. I think it's currently supported in all browsers, but don't, we can use can I use to verify.
Just to be
Basically,
while
what
you
it
look that
does,
up. Sorry to interrupt you. I just have to ask: is this different from just visibility? Because I've used visibility a lot. Visibility is hidden and
yes,
visible.
it is different. It is different because it doesn't make the content invisible. What you use it for is mostly for content that's outside the viewport. And let's say your built website is kind of built in as a lot of modern websites are in kind of strips,
Hmm.
one on top of the other. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
blocks. Sometimes they're
Hmm.
referred to as blocks,
Or
sometimes as
sections.
strips
Yeah.
or sections. And when you load the page, initially you see the first one, two, maybe three uh, sections, but again, if you've built a 10 screen long page, you don't see a lot of sections below that. And now, if the content for a section is wholly contained within that section, it doesn't affect the other sections. There's no like weird CSS that's, pushing content above other sections or stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the section is all the elements within the section are contained within that section. Content visibility basically tells the browser, don't bother with laying out this section. Just don't don't do anything with it. Don't apply any CSS to it. Just skip it.
Wow.
If the user scrolls and it scrolls into view now or is about to scroll into view, it internally uses something like the intersection observer,
Wow.
then then only then actually automatically apply the CSS rules to that section. So you're actually removing a lot of the effort of the initial layout of the browser
Yeah. Because
because it
it
can
goes
just say
from
ignore.
right. Yeah, because it goes from a box with a bunch of stuff inside it to just a box.
Yeah, now there are issues here, like for example, how does the browser know what the size of the box is? Um, So because very often the size of the box, the height of the box, for example, is actually determined by what's inside of it, and
Yeah.
you've not actually laid out what's
Yeah.
inside of it. So there's actually a solution for that. There's like a sister property called I forget. I forgot to check. It's let me quickly check what
You're
it
looking it
is.
up in real time. That's
Uh,
so cool.
Yes, it's basically just a way to tell. It's like it's called um, contain intrinsic size.
That's a
Where you
CSS
tell it,
rule.
yeah,
That's
contain dash intrinsic dash size.
I'm learning so
Where you
much.
tell it, yeah, you tell it basically, you will figure out exactly the size, but for now, assume that it's this.
Wow.
And we actually use it, for example, on the Next Insurance homepage. So we have exactly those kind of strips. So we only apply styling effectively to the top two or three strips, depending on the page and on the device, and all the others only are applied lazily when they actually need to be.
This is so cool.
So this way you can actually reduce the amount of effort for the browser in terms of the CSS. So that's like a quick win that you can achieve, like for your project. I have this really complicated page, I have a lot of CSS, I can't get rid of it because that's our design system, that's what our marketing department came up with. What can I do to speed it up? Here's
Yeah.
a potential quick win for you.
That's not just a quick
We can
win.
put a
That's a
link to an excellent web dev article about it. It was written by some people probably. Una Kravitz,
oh
for
yeah,
example,
Yuna. Yeah,
was
yeah.
one of the authors.
Um,
Yeah, Una.
that's not just a quick win. That's a quick win that I'm betting not a lot of people have heard of. So excellent. In fact, I haven't, and now I'm going to put it everywhere. So it's wait, hang on. Let me see if I remember. It's content visibility and this other three-word thing. What is that again? The long one?
Contain intrinsic size.
Contain intrinsic size. Incredible. I'm a huge
But if
fan.
you look up in the MDN, they have links to one another. So
Okay.
you just remember content visibility and you'll find the other
That
one.
is so cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like there's not just me, but a number of people going like, whoa, right now. Um, awesome. I want to talk to you about, so again, it was SSR, clear, using modern CSS and some of these tricks, clear, which you're using also in Next Insurance and caching and CDNs. Can we speak to, because you mentioned now at Next Insurance, you're doing performance tech leading both on the front end and the back end side. We've spent a considerable amount of time, and you've spent a considerable amount of your career talking about front end stuff. I'm curious if you could talk about the top back end issue, the salient back end issue, the one that keeps coming up, or the most common back end performance problems you see and how we can solve them.
So there are a couple of things. Let me see. Let's talk both at the high level and at the low level. So let's start actually with the low level. A common low level issue is unoptimized database queries. Like you've got a database query, somebody forgot to put in the appropriate index, and the query just runs too long. Now, the problem is that the query works. It's not that it doesn't work. It works. It returns the correct results. So, all the tests pass, but it's just slow. And so, for example, we recently had, in one of our services, we introduced a new database query. It added something like almost a second of processing on top of lots of APIs. Luckily, we identified that, which is thanks to the monitoring that we have on the performance of APIs. And we basically, analyzed it, found the database query, just added the index, and the processing, and that, almost second of processing went down to almost zero.
Wow.
And it was really a very simple win. Once you identify the problem, just to add an index, it's like really, really straightforward thing to do. But that brings us to the higher order issue, which is the how do I phrase it? Like the awareness, you know. A lot of times when the developers are implementing APIs, they don't think about how these APIs are going to be used in terms of the performance profile. So they don't think about, for example, at the end of the day, let's say that API is used as a part of some user journey. So let's say that user is purchasing insurance, he's providing some information. We're using that information to, and we're looking up additional information, and we're doing all sorts of operations on the back end, and the user is waiting for the API to respond, to come back. And sometimes it's you invoke a certain service which then invokes two other services, which they in turn invoke, each one of them invokes two other services. So you've got these kind of tree of API calls.
Yeah.
And they don't think about the fact that every time they add some functionality and make a certain API slower, at the end of the day, it impacts that user's journey, and directly impacts how that user experiences the website. So is that user going to be waiting 1 second for the response, or maybe 5 seconds for the response because certain APIs got slower? and that can make a significant difference. So having that awareness, um, being able to measure it. So, for example, at Next Insurance, we have something like 50 more or less services on the back end, some of them exposing dozens of APIs, some of them exposing hundreds of APIs. How do you monitor all of those? How do you identify performance regressions? That's a challenging problem. And that's one of the things that we're working on. There are certain systems that can help you achieve that, but it's not a trivial thing to do. Uh, Another example of something that I see a lot is how encapsulation can get in the way of performance. Because let's say I have a certain task and it needs some information, so it does an API call, gets that information, uses that information. Now you move to another step in the task, it also needs that information. But because it's encapsulated from
Yeah.
that previous step, it doesn't reuse that information. Instead, it makes that API call again. So and being cognizant of that and pulling up that API call to maybe a higher level that can share this information between these two components, you know, it's not in, intrinsically obvious, and sometimes it kind of breaks encapsulation because maybe you don't want to know, you don't want the parent to know that these components are actually even using that bit of information. So this is kind of one of the things that some a solution like React Query or TenStack
Yeah.
Query tries to solve for you by caching this information not at a shared component level, but totally outside in something like a context or
Yeah.
something like that. But caching is hard. You know the famous saying about the two hardest thing in computer science, right?
Yes. Caching and validation, naming things, and off by one errors. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, so caching is hard.
Yeah. I wonder though if there's many different types of caching. I'll probably do an episode on caching at some point, but there's like ETL caching, so time to live, or TTL, excuse me. ETL is a different concept. There's expiry time caching, and there's ETAG, entity tag caching, right? And or some combination of both. So in this case, where the encapsulation is off, would an ETAG not serve? Again, this is assuming a lot of domain knowledge, and maybe it's a different domain application
Well,
entirely.
that's more relevant when you're doing caching on the front end. Um, but yeah, a lot of the time there's a question of like you have data in a database.
Mm,
Will you know query the database, or will you cache a value returned by the
yeah.
database? But that can be dangerous
Yes.
because then maybe that value can get out of sync and you're
Yeah.
providing incorrect information.
Yeah.
If you're, for example, going to your bank account website,
Yeah.
you would probably be willing to wait a little bit longer to actually get the correct
Balance.
bank balance and not some cached value that's correct for, I don't know, 2 hours ago before your
Yeah.
salary came in or before your credit card,
Yeah.
was deducted money out of your account. But so it's you really need to be careful about these things. By the
Yeah.
way, if you're looking for future guests, I would recommend inviting another performance expert, a great guy called Harry Roberts.
Oh
He's
yeah.
an expert, also known on Twitter as CSS Wizardry, and he gave last year at the Perf Now conference, which is a conference about web performance. He gave an excellent talk about caching.
Yeah.
So if you're really into caching, he's your man.
I actually
Um,
know Harry. We met at Smashing Conf once, and he kept trolling me for being very very handsome in his own words. I still don't know if it was a joke or if it was
so
not, but I'll take the compliment if it was. Yeah.
So I'll give our listeners another tip before we run out of time
Yes.
about some other caching related feature that they can leverage. Are you familiar with the BF cache, also known as back forward cache?
Ah, I thought you were talking about the boyfriend cache. I unfortunately don't have one of those, but no, the back forward cache. I haven't heard of it. What is it?
So that was actually an innovation that Safari did first. So if you just think that Safari never innovates, they're the ones that introduced that one, but now effectively all browsers have it. Think about a scenario where you search something in Google,
Hmm.
you get a page of results, you click a link, you go to a web page, and you look at it, and it's not quite what you're looking for. So you click the back button and you go back to the search results. You would obviously like the search results to load as quickly as possible. And that's one scenario, but there's something that happens a lot in the web where you go down the rabbit hole to some link, and then you come back to some other page or even some other website. Now, you get the benefit of caching if that website is properly configured. So, for example, if that website uses images or JavaScript and they're in the local browser cache, they will load faster. But it still needs to effectively reload the page, re-execute all the JavaScript. So BF Cache, what it does is that when you navigate away from the page, the browser actually takes a memory snapshot of that page that you left. And then when you come back, instead of reloading the page from the network, it just kind of freezes and unfreezes that page. So you effectively are instantly back to where you were before. The page is not reloaded. It just continues as if you never left.
I've
Uh,
actually experienced this in Safari by swipe. So if you swipe back, the previous page is sort of under the current page. But I must say, this BF cache in the latest builds of Safari for some reason fails me, because I'll do that and I will see the snapshot there, but then the snapshot refreshes, and I'm just okay. But then why did you even? I get like
Bugs
they should.
happen.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
a bug, man.
Now, by
It's
the way,
every
that
time.
feature, well, it's a bug that happens every time. I don't, I don't know. By the way, it's a feature that's now built into Chrome as well. So, for example, if you're in Chrome on desktop and your page is compatible with that, for example, the search results, you can, when you navigate back, it's an instant load. You're not reloading the page. You're instantly back in the page. From the page's perspective, it's as if you've never left.
That's awesome.
And by the way, that can throw off some telemetry metrics. For example, if you're measuring visits and you're not careful, then your numbers will all of a sudden change, or you might see a drop in visits because you're used to the visit count going up every time you come back. But now you're just continuing that same session, so you've effectively not come back. You're just it's as if you've never left.
Mm.
Um, Now, so it's called BF cache. It keeps an in-memory, like I said, image or dump of the entire state of that browser tab that you can instantly return to. Now, the page might be incompatible with that. So if you want to leverage that feature, you need to make sure that your page is compatible with it. In Chrome, it's really easy to check. If you open DevTools and you go to the Application tab, there's actually on the left side, you will find the back forward cache. And when you click it, it gives you the ability to check whether or not your page is compatible with it. And
Wow.
if your page is not, it will tell you why it's not compatible. A common reason not to be compatible with that feature is if you're using the unload event handler. Because what happens is that when you navigate away, it will need to fire that unload event. Now, if you all of a sudden come back, well, how did you come back if you've already unloaded?
Yeah.
So unload is intrinsically incompatible with it. Now, by the way, unload is a deprecated event, so you shouldn't be using it at all anyway.
Um,
Um,
okay, I open the application tab of DevTools almost every day, and I've never seen the back forward cache. Absolutely wild. Thank you for that. I will go
did you
look
find it
into it.
now?
I'm not. I'm talking to
Oh,
you.
okay.
I'm
Uh, okay,
once I'm done giving you my full undivided attention, I will go check and let you know. But
for
about
sure.
the
Thank you.
absolute, you deserve it. And that was one thing you mentioned, but then you also just now said something that really resonated with me. But I sort of got I lost my train of thought because of the
That
backforward cache.
unload is deprecated?
Right, that, yes, because so if we're working on an application, so by we I mean the listeners and me, not at the same time, not even the same app, whatever. If we're working on some application, and this application accepts user input, think of an email form where you're typing out the body, and then you go back or you unload the page in some capacity. How I would give you this, like, are you sure you want to exit modal, is by listening to that. So on unload and then
No,
prompt, are you sure?
you on before you're listening to the before unload event handler.
Okay. And that doesn't opt you out of back forward cache.
That might also, that's a good question. I don't remember off the top of my head. It might also, um,
Okay.
but the unload is an event, and the before unload can return a string which is displayed and then gives the user the chance to cancel the unload of the unload.
Yes.
The unload event handler is not, you can't cancel the unload. It's just, it gives you a chance to do, the theoretical purpose was to do some cleanup operations. Maybe send a notification back to the backend telling, hey, the user is left, or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of third-party pixels still use it, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, that's the idea of being giving your code a chance to be aware of the fact that you're leaving the page, and
Does
that's the reason that it's deprecated,
right,
because
because on before unload. So sorry to
it's not
interrupt you.
trustworthy.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
might not fire.
Right.
Think about again. It's the mobile world. Think about in the mobile on the mobile device. You might have the browser open. You then switch over to what did I do? You switch over to let's say to your Facebook app, okay? And the page wasn't unloaded. You didn't close the page. You just switched over the application, right? So far,
Yeah.
so good. But then the device starts running low on resources. You
Mhm.
know what it does? It terminates
It
background processes. So it will effectively unload that page, but it does that very aggressively. It basically just kills those processes. So there's never a chance to actually even invoke the unload event handler.
so
So the unload event handler is totally untrustworthy in the modern web.
so it's this event that only fires maybe, possibly sometimes, but not always.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. And to be fair,
Exactly.
in a realistic use case, you could just use the on before unload, and it would execute reliably, sort of what you'd expect from on unload, right?
No, not really. Again, because if you switch over to a different application on your mobile device, you've not unloaded the page. So
Oh,
why would on
right.
before unload fire? But then the browser, the other browser, the actual mobile operating system just decides to terminate the browser process in order to free up resources. And, no before unload, no unload, nor nothing.
Yeah, yeah. But in that
So
case,
what you're
should they?
supposed to
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go for it. No, you go for it.
I was just going to ask, so in that case, shouldn't we also then deprecate on before unload? Because even that fires just sometimes, in case the kernel decides to slash the process.
At the very least, well, you can't rely on it.
Hmm.
An on before unload is a bit of a courtesy. It's like, are you sure you want to leave?
Yeah.
Think about it as a courtesy, not as something that will happen by definition.
Hmm. But I mean, the event will still only fire sometimes, and tracking pixels can just use that, and it's then
Yeah,
equivalent
but
to
again,
on
it will
unload.
only fire some, but it will only fire sometimes. It might not fire. The on before unload might not fire either. What you're actually encouraged to do is to look at the page hide event. So when your page becomes hidden, you need to assume that you might not ever come back.
That's an event that I have not heard of. Man, I am learning so much. Page hide. That's an event that says the user is gone.
That's page show and page hide.
Okay. And I'm assuming this is equivalent to tab show and tab hide in a tab browser environment.
Well, it's the same event. There's also the visibility. Like as you know, with a browser, there are a million things to do the same way. So I don't remember the exact differences between these two events, but there's the page hide, page show events, and there's the visibility change event as well.
This is so cool. This is so cool. Well, thank you for that. I did want to ask you one question before we wrap up, which is, look, your tech career is almost as long as my life, if not longer than my life. And I think
Why
that's
do
a
you keep reminding me?
because it's so impressive, Dan. It's so impressive to think that. Look, I've been alive so long, but you had this length of experience. To me, that is something I respect and honor highly. I cannot begin to tell you how much. And let me just comment on age a little bit. I think a lot of people go like age is bad if you're old and whatever. I don't think that's true, because I just turned 31 and I look at myself at 21 and I'm like, wow, 21-year-old Tejas was an idiot. In fact, 29-year-old Tejas was an idiot. So for me,
Oh yeah,
I
for
have
sure.
so much respect for that. And I wanted to ask you, um,
Also,
you've
if we're
yes,
lucky, we all get there. If we're
yes,
lucky, we all get there. I
yes,
mean, you want to live to be older.
yes, yeah, exactly right. So it's nothing to like make fun of. But I did want to ask you, um, you've done something I feel like a lot of people listening and a lot of people in tech want to do. What you've done is you've stayed in tune with the pulse for 30 plus years. And a question, a salient question that keeps coming up is, oh, everything's changing so fast. And, it was jQuery and now it's React and then Angular. And I'm struggling to keep in touch. I'm struggling to stay up to date. I'm struggling to keep up with what's relevant. I'm struggling to actually know things without just chasing hype. These are the struggles of listeners of this podcast, but also people in the industry. You've done that exceptionally well. I mean, you went from like 4 kilobytes of memory and no disk and making a game in C++ to staying on the bleeding edge of web performance, core web vitals. You were telling me just now how INP is replacing FID. All of this. You're well
Yeah,
informed.
today.
Today, at the
Today
time of
we were supposed
recording.
to start. We were supposed to start with that,
Well,
and then we got sidetracked.
yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, today's the day. Today's the day in which INP is replacing FID as a core of vital.
At the time
Correct.
of recording,
The,
so this is probably months
and
from
the time
now.
of recording, March 12th. March
March 12th,
12th.
2024. But look, my point being, you've done that. You've done it. You've kept up to date. You've
hmm
stayed relevant. What is the secret? What can people take away? How can people be like you in this way?
First of all, so a couple of things. First of all, you need to do something that aligns with your passion. One of the reasons that I'm able to keep up to date is basically because I'm engaged in things that I enjoy, so I enjoy learning more about them and doing them more. Had I been in, for example, at a certain point in my career, I went down the management track. I was even a VP of R&D for a company for a while, and I came to the conclusion that I'm just not that much into management. So and that what I like to do is actually the nuts and bolts and the technical things. So so basically just following your passion makes it much more easier, let's say, to continue and pursue that thing. And by the way, it's totally okay if your passions change
Mm.
over time, and then you can change track. That's a totally legitimate thing to do. Luckily for me, I like writing coding like 30 years ago, and I still like to do it today. But it might not have been that way, and it's totally fine. It's totally okay, to each their own. So that's one thing. Another thing is you need to accept the fact that you're not going to know everything, and it's okay not to know stuff, and you don't need to change every new hype, and you can kind of, and these days it's really easy to get a taste of technology without really having to go down the rabbit hole. So if you, for example, and that's especially true if you have some experience. So it's great if you can have the time to write code in every framework that comes along. I think a person like Ryan Carniato does that. I think you might do that as well. But that's because that's kind of part of your job description. it's not part of my job description. I don't have the time to try out every new framework that comes along. So instead, I tune in and watch your video of you using a particular framework that I don't have the time to actually play around with. And very often, it's good enough because in a lot of cases, it's effectively, let's put it bluntly, a lot of times it's more of the same.
Yeah.
It's so Solid uses signals and React uses virtual DOM, and they're not the same. But if you understand the basic concepts, you don't have to remember the nitty-gritty. And again, with tools like Google is your friend, and you can use Copilot or ChatGPT to help you write the code, and that's totally fine. You don't need to remember each and every DOM API, and nobody can. So, look in MDN and and just learn how to search.
Yeah.
And people who are alive today, if there's one thing they should know from their life experiences, is how to find stuff on the web.
Mhm.
And that's totally fine. Another thing that I do, and I think you do as well, is that you learn a lot by, you know, teaching
Yeah.
things. So, like you said, I speak at conferences. I speak on podcasts. When I talk about a certain topic, I need to understand it,
Yeah.
and that kind of forces me to learn it. So, in fact, if I want to learn something, then I try to pitch a talk about it. And if that talk gets accepted, then what do you know? I actually need to study and learn it and understand it so that I can properly convey it to other people. And again, I think that's something you can certainly identify
Yeah.
with. And another thing that you can identify with is is as a podcast host, I learn a lot from the
Yeah.
guests that I bring on. So, for example, we mentioned Alex Russell and Harry Roberts and Dan Abramov who were on, and Ryan Corniato and Mishko Hevery, and all these awesome people all come in, and I get to listen to them for an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours, pick their brains and learn about interesting technologies. And again, these days we're really spoiled for choice in all the resources we have for us to learn the content. I'm old enough to remember the days when you wanted to learn something new, you basically had to get a book. And so I learned a technology called Microsoft Component Object Model, by reading a 500-page book.
Wow.
You know, that was a slog, and that's something that today we often don't need to
Yeah.
do. We've got so many online resources that we can use to play with and like test the waters without having to get too deep into things. But again, you definitely just don't need to chase every new fad that comes along. If at the company that you're working on at, you are using, let's say, React, it's totally fine to just be really good at React, and you don't need to know how Solid works or how Svelte works. It's interesting. If you have the time, I highly recommend it, but you don't have to.
Yeah. Incredible. Well, I'm super motivated by that answer and also encouraged that I'm doing a lot of the things you said, and it is actually serving me. Just like from the conference-driven development to consuming others' content to just to having guests on a podcast and picking their brains. In this case, yours. I want to really take a moment and appreciate your time investment in the middle of an active war zone to come on this podcast and share your journey,
Look,
the stories, your performance work, and so much more. Was there something you wanted to add?
well, fortunately for me, I'm not on the front lines, but yeah, it's not a fun period to say the least. Um, Luckily for me, I'm much less impacted than a lot of other people. So I'm very grateful for that, and well aware of my privilege in that context.
Is there? I guess this is something that's Googleable, but I figure since people are probably listening, since I'm listening, what's the quickest way to extend support?
To be honest, I don't necessarily know. Uh, First of all, if you have people who you know in that context, be compassionate. Don't make assumptions. Don't be quick to judge. There are so much identity politics going on, and people making a lot of assumptions about other people just based on who they are, or which groups they are perceived to belong to, rather than who they actually are.
Mm,
So don't jump to conclusions, be kind, be compassionate, be supportive. In terms of actually extending support, I'm sure that in this modern age of Google, if you open Google and look for, let's say, if you want to contribute aid to the people of Gaza, I'm sure that if you go online, you will find ways of making donations. I don't know them off of the top of my head, um,
sure.
but that's definitely something that you can do.
Awesome. Well, I don't take it lightly that we had such an incredible conversation. I do want to thank you for giving me and the listeners the gift of your time, your tenure, your expertise. I learned I could list off for you three things at least that I learned, specifically three. Two of them, CSS rules, content visibility, and the other long one that I just never used
Do we
before.
have time for one more thing, just as to mention?
Sure. Yeah, we have plenty of time.
Okay, so there's something new that's currently supported
Yes.
only in Google, only in Chrome or Chromium-based browsers, not Google, Chromium-based browsers, and that's called the Speculation Rules API. So I don't know how familiar you were with resource hints. Have you heard the term?
I have heard the term, but maybe refresh my memory because I assume
So
there's listeners. Yeah.
really quickly, resource hints are effectively a way for you to let the browser know that certain network resources, there are certain resources you may need in the future, and to download them now or make a network connection now so that it will work faster, or you'll have it when you actually need it. So for example, there's a resource hint called Prefetch.
Yeah.
It says, I don't need a particular resource, but the page that the user might navigate to from this page might actually need that resource. There's a good chance that they will need that resource. So prefetch that resource now, put it in the local cache, and then when the user navigates to that page, it will already be available in the cache and won't be needed to be downloaded on demand.
Is
And
preload
therefore,
another one? Another resource hint?
Preload is similar. Preload is for the current
Okay.
page. So preload is there's a resource that I know that I will need in the current page, but I don't need it yet, but I know that I will need it in the future. Preload it now so that when I do need it, again, it will already be there. So the difference between prefetch and preload is for me, for the current page, something that I know for sure that I will need. Prefetch is for the next page, something that they will likely need, but not necessarily. So that's kind of the difference between prefetch and preload. That's why the browser looks at a preload as an instruction. It needs to preload if it supports it, whereas prefetch is a suggestion.
Hmm.
You tell the browser, if you have like the extra bandwidth, I suggest that you prefetch that. It might not.
Right.
Preload, the browser needs to do the actual preload. Um, so Google recently introduced in Chrome something new that kind of replaces that, or augments that would be a better phrase in certain contexts, which is called the speculation rules. Speculation rules don't work on resources, they work on documents. So you put effectively a script tag in your HTML with the type equals, instead of the type equals JavaScript or whatnot, equals speculation rules as one word. And then inside that script tag, you just put a block of JSON. And it tells the browser to go to a particular document and either prefetch that document or pre-render that entire document.
And the JSON is an object that the browser knows how to the browser can understand the schema.
Parse.
Okay, so the browser will parse that, and I'm assuming it has some type of URL to this foreign document. Okay.
Exactly. Now, prefetch kind of works like prefetch. The big difference is that the regular prefetch, the resource in prefetch, just prefetches a resource, whereas this one prefetches the document and all sub-resources for that
Ooh.
document. So it can work recursively. So, so you know that I might navigate to that page. I don't know which resources that page might
Yeah.
use. So it's difficult for me to prefetch everything that page might use. This way, I tell the browser prefetch that. The browser prefetches the document, parses the document, sees the sub resources, and then prefetches them as well.
That's nuts. I wonder in terms of API design.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
Think about the preload one, the pre-render one. The pre-render one actually tells the browser, see that page, render it in a hidden tab. And then when the user needs it, just flip the tab so that it's instantly on.
Wow. By flip the tab, you mean swap the contents of my active tab to that hidden tab. So it's like a React render.
Exactly.
Whoa.
So the page is already loaded. It's instant on.
And so,
Like think about LCP
yeah,
that's measured as, I don't know, 10 milliseconds.
yeah, or less, right? Because it's just a swapping of a pointer in memory space.
It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
the page is there.
Um. Wow. I wonder if there are frameworks taking advantage of this. I imagine Next.js would boast about this pretty strongly. Um,
I think it's too new. I don't think anybody's using it. I mean, not even enough. Not so many frameworks are even using the what's the page transitions,
view
the
transitions.
view
But that's
transitions.
because it's not
Yeah,
fully compatible. Like Firefox at this point in time has no support for it. So,
and this thing is not compatible either.
okay.
It, but the thing is, it's if it's supported, then it's used, and if it's not supported, then the browser will just ignore that script tag.
This is so cool. I need to do a deep dive on this now. Man, Dan, you are how again, man, I asked you the question. How did you learn about this?
That's an interesting question. Where did I
Is
learn
this
about it
because you're
from?
on
I
the
think I learned
is
it
this
from,
are you on the working
yeah,
group?
I think I learned about it from either Barry Pollard or from Noam Rosenthal.
Ah,
One of
Noam.
these two
I should get
guys.
Noam on the podcast. Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, I'm curious about the API design, why it's a script tag and not a link like everything else. Because you could do link rel recursive preload and then href to your document.
Well, first of all, this trick of using script tags to host JSONs is something that the browser does and also various frameworks do. By the way, you can still also have it remotely. I mean, the script tag can have a source attribute,
Hmm.
so you can reference it. So you can either have it inline or reference it externally. And by the way, when you use like Next.js, where does it put the state? It
Yeah.
puts the state in the script tag.
Yeah. But that makes sense because the state is modeled as JSON. In the case of a
Eh,
preload or prefetch type of
It's also
operation,
JSON.
but it doesn't have to be because you have link rel preload. Link these are HTML elements. They're not. Why are we representing them as JSON blobs here? That's what I don't
No, but
understand.
you're representing the data as JSON. Um, but that's not the only case. I mean, think about resource maps. They're also
Yeah.
represented as JSON for the browser inside the HTML.
Right. Right. Of course. This is really cool. I need to go have a look at this in more detail. I think the fact
I'm
that they
glad I
can
gave you
be
some homework.
For sure. Yeah. The fact that they can be like foreign is and generated. So I can see a strong case, for example, for personalization, right? Because I can if you're a logged in user, then in theory I can preload your next page, like your personal, like your shopping cart can be preloaded in this like phantom tab, and I can swap to it.
Yeah, you need to be really careful with that, though. I'll give you two things to watch out for. First of all, you might be overloading your servers. Think about, for example, like um, you've got a marketing page that from there you go into your actual main application. And currently, only like 1% of visitors actually engage. Okay? If you preload for everybody, all of a sudden you've upped your engagement to 100%. You're
Yeah.
putting 100, like 100. 100 times more load
Yeah.
on your servers. So that's one thing to watch out for. Another thing is also not to make sure not it doesn't get in the way of your telemetry, that you count all those hidden visits as actual visits, you
Yeah.
know. So you need to be careful with
Yeah,
these
but
sort
that
of
you can
things.
mitigate with a header, right? You just like set a
Oh yeah, and you can also check the page visibility because when it's rendered in that hidden frame, it's not visible.
yeah, but I hear you. Those are considerations to be had for sure. That is awesome homework. I thank you so much. All the listeners, thank you. I mean, it may not be new at the time this episode goes live, but maybe by the time this episode goes live, it will be supported in all major browsers. That would be a treat.
Yeah, it's marked as experimental in the MDN, so I highly doubt it. It'll be a while.
Okay. Well, in any case, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. We're at time. So let's leave it here. We started with a big agenda and we did not stick to it at all, which I absolutely love. An organic conversation. I think still with deep dives on these CSS rules I never heard of, on this, on the what is it, BF cache, so much, such a wealth of information. And you know what that means? It means we just have to do this again so we get to the actual content we planned. And if we,
Let me see if I can get
the thumbs up,
the session to do the thumbs up. No,
and
when
if
I
we,
want it, it doesn't work.
and if we fail to stick to the script the second time, we just keep going until we do, if you're open to it, of course. But
I
Dan,
am. Always
awesome.
a pleasure speaking with you. You know
I'm
that.
thank you, thank you, thank you. On behalf of the listeners and on myself, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast, and I can't wait to do it again.
Same for me.
Thank you for joining my discussion with the great Dan Shappir. I hope you learned a lot about performance optimization, even at the CSS level, the back forward cache, and more. Feel free to check him out on X, that's formerly Twitter, at Dan Shappir, and really heed his words because he's a real expert, as we've established through this episode. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you to leave up to a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify while also following the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, then if you'll subscribe to the channel and maybe leave a thumbs up, all of this would support the podcast with really no cost to you other than like maybe a few milliseconds of clicking. But it would definitely help the podcast in a big way while also signaling to me that this is worth continuing. If you found anything useful here, I'd invite you to share it as well on your social channels with your friends, because that's the whole point. We do this is education. Thanks for joining this episode. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.